In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And aboard certain ships, the war is not outside the hull. It's inside your skull, hammered in with rusted tools, whispering that you should never, ever stop. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a Vox spool buried in the wreckage of an abandoned orbital, recorded by a man named Rendahl Caeve, who was once Imperial Navy, a normal crewman on a normal ship, and is now something else entirely. Something with crude implants in his brain, and a god's voice in the silence, and an axe he doesn't remember carving devotions into. This is a story about Khorne, not from the outside, from the inside, from the man who charges down the boarding ramp, who tears through barricades, who wakes up with blood under his fingernails and no memory of putting it there. And who is telling you all of this because the lucidity comes in waves now, shorter and farther apart, and he needs to speak while the words are still his. It is not a comfortable listen. It is not supposed to be. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing you lose is not your soul. It is the silence. There was a time when I could sit in the dark, in the belly of a warship, and hear nothing but the hum of the reactor and the slow tick of cooling metal. I remember that. I hold on to it the way a drowning man holds on to a scrap of wreckage. That quiet. That blessed, terrible quiet. I have not heard it in years, maybe decades. Time is a rusted blade aboard the wrath-bound edict, and it cuts differently for everyone. My name is Rendahl Caeve, and I am a killer. Not a warrior, not a soldier. A killer. There is a difference, though most do not live long enough to understand it. A warrior fights for something. A soldier follows orders. A killer simply does what his blood demands. I tell you this because I want you to understand what I was before I explain what I have become. If you are hearing this, then someone has recovered the Vox spool I buried in the wreckage of the Pelgranith orbital. Maybe an inquisitor, maybe a scavenger, maybe another poor bastard who is about to learn that the void is much darker than anyone ever told him. It does not matter. What matters is that you listen and you understand, because what I am going to tell you is the truth. Not the truth that the ecclesiarchy preaches, and not the truth that the ruinous powers whisper into the ears of the desperate. The truth is simpler and uglier than either side would have you believe. It is this. Every man has a threshold, and once you cross it, you never come back. You only go deeper. I am going to tell you about my life. About what it means to serve aboard a vessel consecrated to the blood god, about what it feels like to breach the hull of a ship and pour into its corridors like hot blood into a wound, about the things I have done and the things that have been done to me, and the one question I cannot stop asking, even though I know the answer, will destroy whatever is left of me. I will tell you all of it, not because I seek absolution. There is none for men like me. I tell you because the lucidity comes in waves now, shorter and farther apart, and I need to speak while I still can, while the words are still mine, while I can still remember what words are for. So let me begin with the boarding of the Ardent Magistrate, because that is where everything became irreversible, and because the memory is so vivid that I can taste the blood on my teeth even now, sitting in the dark with this Vox recorder pressed against my mouth like a prayer. We hit the Ardent Magistrate amidships, port side, in a section where the hull was already buckling from the sustained bombardment of our prow lance batteries. The edict had run parallel to her for 37 minutes, trading fire at a range that would have been suicidal for any sane crew. But sanity is a luxury we abandoned a long time ago, and besides, our shipmaster Osek Dravanthier has a poet's instinct for violence. He knew the exact moment when their void shields flickered, when the overloaded generators on their port quarter stuttered and left a gap just wide enough for a concentrated lance strike. He ordered the helmsman to close to ramming distance, while the rest of us were already flooding into the boarding torpedoes and assault boats. You learn to move fast aboard the Edict. Hesitation is a sin that Khorne does not forgive, and his punishments are delivered not by priests, but by the thing inside your own skull that screams when you hold still for too long. I was in boarding claw 3, packed in with 60 other men and women who stank of sweat, blood, and the chemical residue of combat stimulants that our chirurgeons had pumped into us before the engagement. We wore mismatched armor, most of it salvaged from a dozen different void engagements, scratched and dented and daubed with symbols that I once would have found blasphemous. I remember looking down at my own chest plate and seeing the sigil of the blood god etched into the metal with what I think was a human finger bone used as a stylus. I had carved it myself during one of the blackouts, the periods of lost time that come more and more frequently now. I did not remember doing it, but I recognized my own handwriting in the jagged strokes. There is something profoundly disturbing about finding evidence of your own devotion that you cannot recall performing. It is like waking up with someone else's blood under your fingernails and knowing with absolute certainty that you enjoyed putting it there. The torpedo hit the magistrate's hull like a fist punching through a rib cage. The impact slammed us forward in our restraint harnesses, and I felt my teeth crack together and tasted copper. The drill nose of the torpedo was already grinding through armor plating, filling the cabin with a howl that was part mechanical and part something else, something that lived in the vibration itself, a frequency that resonated with the thing that Khorne had planted in the base of my skull. Around me, my comrades were already screaming, not in fear, in hunger, in anticipation. The woman strapped in beside me, Thren Voshka, had bitten through her own lower lip and was laughing through a mask of blood, her eyes rolled back so far that only the whites showed. She was already gone, already in the grip of the nails. Not the true butcher's nails that the Astar tests wear, but the lesser implants, the crude copies that our chirurgeons hammer into our skulls with rusted tools and whispered prayers. They do not work as well as the originals. They do not need to. All they need to do is drown out the part of your brain that says, "Stop." The boarding ramp dropped, and we poured out into the guts of the ardent magistrate. The corridor was lit by emergency lumens that cast everything in a deep arterial red, and the air was thick with the stink of ruptured coolant lines and burned insulation. I had my axe in my right hand and a stub pistol in my left, though I already knew I would not use the pistol. I never do, not anymore. There is something about the moment of contact, metal meeting flesh, bone giving way beneath the edge, that satisfies a need so deep and so fundamental that it feels like breathing. I have tried to explain this to people who have not felt it, and I cannot. It is like trying to describe color to a blind man. Either you know or you do not, and once you know, you can never unknow it. The first defender I met was an armsman, Imperial Navy. He was young, probably no older than I was when I first came aboard the Scythian Resolve, and he was shaking so badly that his shotgun barrel was tracing figure eights in the air. I saw his face in the red light, and I saw the terror there, the absolute incomprehension of what was coming at him down that corridor. And for one fraction of a heartbeat, I felt something. A twinge, a ghost of recognition. I knew that face. Not his face specifically, but the expression. I had worn it once. I had been that boy, standing in a corridor very much like this one, staring at something monstrous and trying to remember my training. And then the moment passed. The lucidity flickered and died like a candle in a gale, and the red tide came rushing in, and I was moving. I do not remember killing him. I remember the after. I remember standing over what was left of him and feeling the warmth of his blood soaking through the gaps in my armor, pooling in the joints, running down my wrists in thin rivulets that steamed in the cold, recycled air, and feeling not satisfaction, something beyond satisfaction, something that has no word in low Gothic or high, a rightness, as though the universe had briefly aligned itself around the act, and everything, the ship, the void, the screaming, the blood god on his throne of skulls, all of it existed solely so that this moment could happen. That is what Khorne gives you, not power, not immortality. Purpose. Terrible, absolute, unquestionable purpose. We swept through the lower decks of the Magistrate like a hemorrhage. 60 of us had poured out of boarding Claw 3, and we were not the only assault force. Claws 1 and 2 had hit the forward sections, and the Edict's complement of Osek's own chosen, the transhuman monsters in their ancient red ceramite, had teleported directly into the engineerium. That was unusual. Khornate forces despise teleportation. They consider it cowardly, a cheat, a way of avoiding the sacred act of approach. But Osek is not a typical servant of the blood god, and his pragmatism has kept the edict operational for longer than any ship in our ragged fleet has a right to survive. He understands something that the screaming zealots do not. Khorne does not truly care how the blood is spilled. He cares that it is spilled. And if teleporting a squad of berserkers into the enemy's reactor chamber results in a faster, more thorough slaughter, then the blood god's thirst is slaked all the same. I have seen men argue this point and die for it. Theological disputes aboard the edict tend to be resolved with edged weapons. But I was speaking of the Magistrate. We took the lower decks in less than an hour. The defenders fought bravely, I will give them that. They had set up barricades at every corridor junction, and their officers had organized overlapping fields of fire that should have turned each intersection into a killing ground. It would have worked against a conventional boarding force. Against us, it was like building a dam out of paper. We did not advance tactically. We did not leapfrog from cover to cover or lay down suppressive fire. We ran. We charged. We threw ourselves at the barricades and tore them apart with our hands and our axes and our teeth. I watched Threnn Voshka vault a barricade made of welded deck plates and land on top of 3 armsmen, and by the time I had climbed over after her, all 3 were dead, and she was already moving toward the next junction, not even pausing to retrieve the knife she had left embedded in someone's eye socket. We lost people, of course. The fury does not make you bulletproof. I saw a man named Kelt take a shotgun blast to the face and keep running for 3 more steps before his body realized it was dead. I saw another, whose name I cannot remember, step on a mine that the defenders had placed at a corridor intersection and simply cease to exist from the waist down. And even then, the upper half of him was still reaching forward, still crawling toward the enemy, still trying to close the distance, because that is what the nails do. They take the part of you that wants to stop, and they burn it out, and what is left is a thing that only moves in one direction. We reached the bridge of the Ardent Magistrate 3 hours after initial boarding. By that point, the ship was ours in every meaningful sense. The fires had been burning for over an hour, fed by ruptured fuel lines and the oxygen bleeding from a dozen hull breaches. The gravity had failed on 2 decks, and the emergency void sealing systems had partially engaged, creating a maze of sealed bulkheads and pressurized corridors that we had to cut through one by one. I was covered in blood from scalp to boot. Most of it was not mine. My axe had chipped, and I had replaced it twice, pulling weapons from the dead, both theirs and ours. My hands were numb. My throat was raw from screaming things I do not remember, and the red haze was beginning to recede, just slightly, just enough to let a sliver of clarity creep in through the cracks, and that is always the worst part. Not the killing. The killing is easy. It is what comes after. It is the moment when the fog lifts and you see what you have done, really see it, and you realize that you enjoyed every second of it, and that you would do it all again, right now, without hesitation, if only someone would put a living body in front of you. The bridge doors had been welded shut from inside. It took our heavies 20 minutes to cut through with plasma torches, while the rest of us stood in the corridor, twitching and pacing like caged animals. When the doors finally came open, we found what we always find. The command crew had destroyed their cogitators and voided the data stacks. The captain was dead at her own hand. Most of her officers had followed suit. There were perhaps 8 crew members still alive, huddled behind an overturned console, weeping and praying to a god emperor who was not coming to save them. I want to tell you that I felt mercy. I want to tell you that in that moment of clarity, standing on the bridge of a dying ship with blood dripping from my hands, I looked at those 8 terrified people and felt the stirring of something human. I want to tell you that, but I will not lie to you. What I felt was annoyance. Annoyance that they were not fighting, annoyance that they had given up. Annoyance that Khorne's gift, the red purpose, the beautiful simplicity of combat was being wasted on people who would not even raise their fists. And so I turned and walked away, back into the burning corridors, to find someone who would. That is what I have become. That is the thing that lives inside the shell of the man who was once Rendahl Caeve, armsman, second class, Imperial Navy, loyal servant of the Imperium of mankind. And the worst part, the part that keeps me talking into this vox spool in the stolen hours, when the lucidity comes and the nails are quiet, is that I cannot tell you exactly when the change happened. There was no single moment, no dramatic fall. It was more like the tide coming in. You do not notice each individual wave, but eventually you look down and realize the water is at your chest, and you have forgotten how to swim. Let me tell you how the water rose. I was born on Pelgranith, which is the sort of world that the Imperium produces by the thousands, and then immediately forgets. An industrial world, not a hive, not quite, but close enough that the distinction was academic. Pelgranith made things. Specifically, it made hull plating for the Imperial Navy, great sheets of rolled ceramite and plasteel that were shipped off-world by the megaton and turned into the skin of warships that most Pelgranith citizens would never see. My father worked in Foundry 16, and his father before him, and his father before that, back for as many generations as anyone cared to count. The air on Pelgranith tasted of metal shavings and chemical coolant, and the sky was a permanent bruise of industrial smoke that turned the sun into a dim orange smear. It was not a bad life by Imperial standards. We ate, we had a roof. The Arbitesse left us alone as long as the production quotas were met. I could have stayed. I could have spent my life feeding sheets of metal into stamping machines and praying to the God Emperor on feast days and dying at 53 of lung calcification like everyone else. But I was 17 and I was angry, and angry young men on Pelgranith had 2 options, the gangs or the Navy. I chose the Navy. I want you to understand that there was no grand ambition behind it. I did not dream of glory or adventure. I did not burn with patriotic fervor. I signed the recruitment papers because a Navy recruiter came through our district and told me I would be fed 3 meals a day and given a uniform and sent somewhere that was not Pelgranith. And at 17, that was enough. That was the entirety of my motivation. The Imperium's vast military machine runs on men like me, men who are not heroes, not zealots, not dreamers, just tired boys looking for a way out of the Foundry. Basic training was on the orbital station above Pelgranith, a vast, spinning torus called Waystation Gelkis that smelled of recycled air and disinfectant. 8 weeks of being screamed at by drill abbots who seemed personally offended by our existence. We learned to march, to shoot, to maintain our weapons, to seal a pressure suit in under 90 seconds, to survive in void conditions, and most importantly, to obey orders without thinking. The Imperial Navy does not want thinkers. It wants components, interchangeable human parts that can be slotted into the vast machinery of a warship and expected to function until they break, at which point they are replaced. I was good at being a component. I learned that about myself during training. I had a talent for shutting down the questioning part of my brain and simply doing what I was told. The drill abbots called it discipline. Looking back, I think it was something else. I think it was the first sign of the hole that was always inside me, the empty space where something fundamental should have been but was not, and that Khorne would later fill with fire. I was assigned to the Scythian Resolve, a lunar-class cruiser operating out of Battlefleet Corinthus in the Segmentum Obscurus. She was old, the Resolve. Her keel had been laid down in M38, and her hull bore the scars of 1,000 engagements, patched and repatched and patched again until the original structure was more scar tissue than anything else. But she was solid, dependable, the kind of ship that would not win any races, but would absorb punishment that would gut a lighter vessel and keep firing. I loved her, in the way that a man can love a machine that keeps him alive. I loved the deep thrum of her plasma reactors, the way the deck plates vibrated under my boots with a rhythm that I could feel in my bones. I loved the vastness of her, the miles of corridors and maintenance shafts and cavernous hangar bays. I loved the fact that aboard the Resolve, I had a purpose. I was Armsman Second Class Rendahl Caeve, Hull Section 17, Port Battery Complement, and I knew exactly who I was and what I was supposed to do. My job was simple. I was part of the ship's security complement. When we were not at battle stations, we patrolled the corridors, maintained order among the lower deck ratings, broke up fights in the mess halls, and generally served as the visible arm of the captain's authority. When we were at battle stations, we manned the secondary defense positions, ready to repel boarders or respond to hull breaches. It was not glamorous work. Most of it was tediously routine. We spent months, sometimes years, in transit between war zones, and during those long transits, the biggest threat was not the enemy, but boredom. Boredom and the slow, grinding tension of living in a metal box with 4,000 other people, none of whom chose to be there, all of whom were one bad day away from doing something desperate. I served aboard the Resolve for 11 years. I rose to Armsman First Class, which meant I led a fire team of 8 men and women and had a slightly larger bunk than the ratings. I fought in 3 fleet engagements and 2 boarding actions, both of which were defensive. The first was against Orc freebooters who had latched onto our hull with crude docking clamps and tried to pour through a cargo bay that we had reinforced with blast shields and overlapping fire lanes. It lasted 4 hours and we lost 19 people, but we held. The second was against Dark Eldar raiders who came through the walls themselves, cutting portals in the hull with weapons that seemed to fold reality like paper. That one was worse. We lost 63 crew in less than an hour, and by the time it was over, I had killed my first Xenos at arm's length, driving a boarding pike through the chest of a creature so fast that I should not have been able to hit it at all. I still do not know how I managed it. Luck, probably. Or something else. Something that was watching even then. I want to linger on those 11 years, because they are the last years I can call my own. They are the foundation of everything that came after, the bedrock of normalcy against which the madness of my current existence stands in hideous contrast. I had friends aboard the Resolve. I had a bunkmate named Torsen Dahl, a wiry little man from some agri-world in the segmentum solar who snored like a broken servo motor and could repair any piece of equipment you put in front of him, with nothing but a multi-tool and creative profanity. I had a section chief named Gira Ostavane, a woman built like a boarding torpedo who had served in the Navy for 30 years and could strip and reassemble a las gun in the dark while carrying on a conversation about the theological implications of the Emperor's divinity. I had a commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Tolvain Prek, who was the finest leader I have ever served under, before or since. A man who could inspire you to hold a corridor against impossible odds simply by standing next to you and being absolutely, unshakably calm. These are the people I betrayed. These are the people I killed, or helped to kill, or stood by and watched while others killed them. And the thing that haunts me in the quiet hours, the thing that the nails cannot quite erase, is that I can still see their faces. I can still hear Torsen snoring. I can still feel Gira's hand on my shoulder after the dark Eldar boarding, squeezing once, hard. The Navy's wordless language for you did well. You survived. I am glad you are still here. I can still hear Lieutenant Commander Prek's voice in my ear during a hull breach, calm as still water, telling me exactly where to position my fire team to seal the gap. These memories are mine. The nails have not taken them yet. I do not know if they ever will. Sometimes I think Khorne leaves them there on purpose, like a barb in a wound, because the pain of remembering who I was makes the rage burn hotter. The Scythian resolve met her fate in the Nethraval Passage, a warp corridor in the trailing reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus that had been used by the Imperial Navy for centuries as a shortcut between the Corinthus subsector and the forward staging grounds near the Eye of Terror. We had made the run before, twice, without incident. The passage was considered relatively stable, as warp routes go, and our navigator, a skeletal figure named Istreth, whose third eye wept constantly and who spoke in a whisper that made your skin crawl, had assured the captain that the tides were favorable. He was wrong, or he was lying. I have considered both possibilities in the years since, and I no longer know which is more terrifying. We entered the warp on schedule. For the first 3 days, the transit was normal. The Geller field held steady, the ship hummed with its usual subsonic vibration, and the crew went about their duties with the practiced routine of people who had done this 100 times. I was on patrol in the lower decks, walking the same route I had walked 1,000 times, checking the same pressure seals, nodding to the same maintenance servitors, exchanging the same tired jokes with the same ratings. Everything was normal. And then on the 4th day, the screaming started. It came from the lower holds, from the sections of the ship that were largely uninhabited, the deep storage bays and sealed maintenance corridors where only servitors and the occasional tech adept ever went. At first, we assumed it was a ruptured steam line or a malfunctioning servitor caught in a feedback loop. The sounds that a ship makes in the warp are strange and varied, and experienced crews learn to ignore most of them. But this was different. This was not mechanical. This was a human voice, or something that had once been human, raised in a howl that carried through the deck plates and the bulkheads and the very bones of the ship. A sound that bypassed your ears entirely and went straight into the center of your brain where it sat like a coal, burning and whispering. I cannot tell you what the whisper said, not because I do not remember, but because there are no words for it in any language I know. It was not speech, it was not thought. It was more like a feeling, an emotion so intense and so alien that experiencing it was like trying to swallow a star. It was rage, pure, distilled, cosmic rage. Rage at everything that existed, at the fact of existence itself, at the unforgivable crime of a universe that contained things that were not yet broken and bleeding. And buried within that rage, like a diamond in a furnace, was a promise of purpose, a promise that the rage was not meaningless, that it was holy, that it was the truest expression of the only truth that mattered, that strength is the only virtue, and the strong exist to destroy the weak. And in the act of destruction there is a glory that transcends everything, even death. I felt it. We all felt it. 4,000 men and women aboard the Scythian Resolve, and every single one of us heard that whisper, and every single one of us responded to it. The difference was in how we responded. Most of the crew fought it. They gritted their teeth and clenched their fists and recited their prayers, and held on to whatever fragment of faith or discipline or simple stubborn humanity they could find. The commissar aboard, a gaunt woman named Hailstrad, shot 3 ratings who started bashing their heads against a bulkhead, and her actions bought time, a few hours maybe, for the officers to organize a response. The navigator sealed himself in his sanctum and fought to hold the ship on course. The Geller field generators were running at maximum output, their machine spirits screaming in binary distress, and the tech priests were crawling over them like ants, performing emergency rites of appeasement. But some of us did not fight it. Some of us listened, and I was one of them. I am not proud of it. I am not making excuses. I am simply telling you what happened. When the whisper came, something inside me answered, the hole that had always been there, the empty space at the center of my being that I had papered over with duty and routine and the mechanical comfort of service. That hole recognized the whisper the way a lock recognizes a key. And it opened, and the rage poured in, not like a flood, but like a homecoming. Like blood returning to a limb that had been numb for years, and for the first time in my life, I felt complete. I felt whole. I felt like I had been asleep for 28 years and had finally woken up. That is how it begins. Not with a ritual, not with a pact signed in blood, not with a demon emerging from a pentagram to offer you power in exchange for your soul. It begins with a whisper and a hole, and the horrifying realization that the thing filling the hole feels better than anything you have ever experienced. Better than food, better than sleep, better than the warmth of another human body against yours. Better than all of it, because all of it was always just a distraction from the hunger that was always there, the hunger you never knew you had until someone finally offered to feed it. The mutiny began on the 6th day. I do not know who struck the first blow. There are those who say it was a rating in the engine room who picked up a wrench and crushed the skull of the tech priest standing next to him. Others say it started in the armory, where a group of armsmen overpowered the quartermaster and began distributing weapons to anyone who wanted them. I have heard it said that the navigator himself turned, that his warp eye opened fully and became a conduit through which something vast and terrible poured itself into the ship. I do not know the truth. What I know is that by the time the 6th day turned into the 7th, the Scythian Resolve was tearing itself apart from the inside. I killed Torsen Dahl on the morning of the 7th day. He was still asleep in his bunk when I came for him, and I hope, that the first blow killed him instantly. I used a length of pipe that I had pulled from a maintenance conduit. I do not remember deciding to kill him. I remember standing over his bunk, looking down at his sleeping face, and feeling the rage demand that I act, and acting. It was that simple, that effortless, like breathing. And the worst part, the part that I will carry with me into whatever hell awaits me, is that the lucidity hit me while I was still standing over him. The fog cleared just for a moment, just long enough for me to see what I had done, and I felt the rage retreat like a wave pulling back from the shore, and in the space it left behind there was nothing. Not horror, not guilt, not grief, nothing. A vast howling emptiness. And then the rage came back, and the emptiness filled, and I moved on to the next one. Gira Ostavani died fighting. She had barricaded herself in the section chief's quarters with 6 loyalists, and they held out for almost 2 hours before we cut through the door. She killed 2 of us, one with her service las pistol and one with her bare hands, snapping a man's neck with a technique that I had seen her demonstrate once during a training exercise when she was laughing and making it look easy. When I reached her, she was wounded in the shoulder and the thigh, and she looked at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Not just recognition of my face, but recognition of what I had become. She did not beg, she did not curse me. She said one word, my name, Rendahl. And it was the way she said it that broke something inside me, some final structural support that had been holding the old Rendahl Caeve in place. Because she said it with pity, not anger, not hatred, pity. And I could not bear it. I could not bear to be pitied by a dead woman, because that is what she was. We both knew it. And so I ended it quickly and moved on, and the rage closed over the wound like scar tissue over a burn. Lieutenant Commander Prek survived the mutiny. I do not know how. By the time the fighting was over and the loyalists were dead or imprisoned in the lower holds, he had vanished, gone, evaporated into the miles of corridors and maintenance shafts that honeycombed the Resolve. We searched for him for days, and Osek Dravanthir himself, who had appeared during the mutiny like a red specter from the deeper warp, leading a coterie of warriors in ancient crimson armor who had materialized in the ship's chapel as though summoned by the bloodshed. Osek ordered his death as a priority. But Prek was a ghost. He knew the ship better than anyone alive, and he used that knowledge to stay one step ahead of every hunting party we sent after him. For weeks after the mutiny, strange things would happen aboard the ship. Fires would break out in munitions storage. Navigation systems would malfunction. Patrol teams would disappear and be found dead, killed with surgical precision, a single stab wound to the throat, or a severed artery behind the knee. Prek was fighting a one-man war against the thing his ship had become, and I hated him for it. Not because he was killing us, but because every dead patrol was a reminder that somewhere aboard this ship, someone was still loyal. Someone was still human. Someone was still what I should have been. They caught him eventually. 3 months after the mutiny, one of Osek's Astar Tess, a monster called Vorek, who had been with the World Eater since before the heresy, and whose armor was so caked in dried blood that its original color was a matter of theological debate, tracked Prek to a maintenance crawl space deep in the bilge decks. The story I was told, and I believe it, because Vorek is many things but a liar, is not one of them, is that Prek fought. Even cornered, even outnumbered, even facing a transhuman killing machine twice his size and 10,000 years his senior, Tolvain Prek fought. He had a las pistol and a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken stanchion, and he put a las bolt through Vorek's left eye lens before the Astar Tess closed the distance. It did not kill Vorek. Nothing kills Vorek. But it left a scar, a cracked and blackened crater in the ancient ceramite of his helm, and I have seen Vorek touch that scar sometimes, absently, the way a man might touch a memento of someone he respected. Khorne values courage, even in an enemy. Especially in an enemy. Prek's skull was taken and mounted on the prow shrine of the ship alongside 100 others, and that was the end of the Scythian Resolve's last loyalist. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the emptiness again, brief and cold, before the rage filled it back in. With Prek dead and the loyalist resistance crushed, the real transformation began. The Scythian Resolve was stripped of everything that marked her as an imperial vessel. The Aquilas were torn from the bulkheads and melted down. The chapel was gutted and rebuilt as a fighting pit, a circular depression in the deck where disputes were settled and offerings were made. The banners and honors that had hung in the officers' mess for centuries were burned. In their place, the walls were painted with blood, layered over and over until the metal was hidden beneath a thick, cracking crust of it that smelled of copper and something older. Something that reminded me of the smell you get when you break open a geode and the air inside, sealed for millions of years, finally escapes. It was the smell of the warp leaking through, of the boundary between the materium and the immaterium growing thin. Osek Dravanthier renamed the ship. She became the Wrath-bound Edict, and the name was branded into her hull in letters 30 meters high, burned into the metal by the same plasma torches that had once repaired her battle damage. I watched that branding from the observation deck, standing among a crowd of my fellow turncoats, and I remember the heat on my face and the stink of vaporizing metal and the way the letters seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the plasma, a sullen, brass-colored luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ship was alive, not in the way that all ships are alive, with their machine spirits and their idiosyncratic personalities. Alive in a different way. Aware. Hungry. I could feel her in the deck beneath my feet, a vibration that was too rhythmic to be mechanical, too organic, like standing on the chest of something enormous that was breathing in its sleep. The Wrath-bound Edict had become a temple, and we were its congregation, and the god we worshipped demanded only one thing of us. Let me tell you about Osek Dravanthier, because you cannot understand the Edict without understanding the man who commands her. He is World Eater, Old World Eater. He claims to have fought at the Siege of Terra, though I do not know if this is true because Chaos Space Marines lie about their histories the way normal men lie about their age, and the Eye of Terror does strange things to memory and time. What I do know is that he is ancient, and he is terrifying, and he is not what you would expect from a servant of Khorne. The Blood God's champions are supposed to be mindless brutes, frothing berserkers who have surrendered their intellect to the rage. Osek is nothing like that. He is calm, controlled. When he speaks, which is rarely, his voice is low and precise, and his words have the careful weight of stones placed on a scale. He does not shout. He does not rant. He watches with eyes that are the color of cooling embers, and he calculates, and when he acts, it is with a violence so sudden and so total that it is over before you realize it has begun. I have seen him kill a man mid-sentence, reaching out with one ceramite gauntlet and simply crushing the man's skull as though it were an egg without interrupting his own train of thought. I have seen him stand motionless at the helm for hours while a battle raged around him, reading the flow of combat the way a scholar reads a text, and then issue a single order that changed the outcome entirely. He is brilliant. He is monstrous. And he is utterly, completely devoted to Khorne, not as a berserker is devoted, with mindless fury, but as a priest is devoted, with studied reverence and theological certainty. I once heard him say that Khorne is not the god of mindless slaughter. He said that mindless slaughter is an insult to the blood god, that Khorne demands skill, that every kill should be an act of craftsmanship, and that the warrior who kills 100 men with wild swings dishonors Khorne, compared to the warrior who kills 10 men with 10 perfect strikes. I do not know if this is orthodox doctrine. I suspect it is not. But aboard the Edict, Osek's word is doctrine, and so we train. We drill. We practice our blade work in the fighting pits until our arms burn and our hands bleed. And when we board an enemy vessel, we do so with purpose and precision, not as a mob, but as a blade. And the killing, while savage, is never wasteful. This is what outsiders do not understand about life aboard a Khornate vessel. They imagine chaos, anarchy, a ship full of screaming lunatics hacking each other apart in between engagements. And yes, there is violence. The fighting pits claim lives every day. Disputes are settled with edged weapons. The weak are culled regularly and without sentiment. But there is also structure, hierarchy, order of a kind. It is not the order of the Imperium with its ranks and regulations and bureaucratic chains of command. It is the order of a pack. The strong lead, the skilled survive, and everyone from the lowest bilge scrubber to the mightiest Astar-Tess champion knows exactly where they stand because their position was earned with blood and can be lost the same way. The hierarchy aboard the Edict is simple. At the top sits Osek, and no one challenges him because the last person who tried is now a decorative feature of the bridge, his flayed skin stretched across a frame and hung above the command throne like a tapestry. Below Osek are his Astar-Tess, the World Eaters, and the renegade Marines from other legions and chapters who have found their way to us over the centuries. There are perhaps 40 of them aboard, and they are gods among us. Not metaphorically. To the mortal crew, the Astar-Tess are living manifestations of Khorne's favor, 8-foot-tall instruments of destruction who can kill a man with a backhanded slap, and who heal from wounds that would kill a normal human 10 times over. They do not eat with us. They do not sleep near us. They occupy the upper decks, the former officers' quarters and command spaces, and they descend to the lower decks only to fight, to train, or to select mortals for their retinues. Below the Astar-Tess are the champions. These are the mortal warriors who have proven themselves in the pits and in combat, who have killed enough and bled enough to earn the attention of the blood god. They are marked physically by Khorne's favor. Some bear mutations, an extra joint in the arm that allows for a faster strike, skin that has thickened into something close to natural armor, eyes that can see in total darkness. Others carry demon weapons, blades that whisper and moan and drink blood with a thirst that mirrors their wielders. I am a champion. I do not know when I earned the title. It was not conferred in a ceremony. There was no announcement. One day I was simply treated differently, given better weapons, better armor, a berth closer to the fighting pits. The other mortals began to step aside when I walked past. I realized that I had changed, that the thing I was becoming had become visible to others, and the realization came with no feeling at all. No pride, no fear, just the same flat, burning emptiness that the rage fills and the lucidity reveals. Below the champions are the reavers, the rank-and-file warriors who make up the bulk of the boarding parties. These are the men and women who do the actual killing in most engagements, who pour through the breach in a screaming tide and overwhelm the enemy with sheer ferocity and numbers. Most of them have the lesser nails, the crude implants that our chirurgeons install in anyone who volunteers or who is volunteered by their peers. The nails change you. They sand down the edges of your personality until what is left is a weapon in human form. Reavers do not have hobbies. They do not have conversations. They do not form friendships. Not really, though they form bonds of a kind. The bond between two blades in the same sheath. The understanding that you and the person next to you exist for the same purpose and will die serving that purpose, and that this is enough. Thren Voshka is a reaver. She was before the nails, and she will be until something kills her, and when that happens, she will not care, and neither will anyone else. And that is the way of things. Below the reavers are the thralls, the non-combatants, the thousands of wretched souls who keep the edict running. Some are volunteers who worship Khorne through labor. Others are slaves captured from boarded vessels, put to work and eventually used up. The edict consumes people the way a furnace consumes fuel. There is always a need for more. This is why we raid. This is why we board. Not just for the killing, but for the practical necessities of maintaining a warship that has been excommunicated from every supply chain in the galaxy. I want to describe a typical cycle aboard the Edict so that you understand the rhythm of this existence. We do not measure time in days and nights because there is no sun and no horizon, and the ship's chronometers were smashed long ago. Instead, we measure time in cycles, each one defined by the thrum of the reactor and the announcements that echo through the ship's address system in a voice that is part human and part something else, a vox unit that has been modified or perhaps possessed so that its tones carry a subsonic resonance that makes your blood itch. A cycle begins with the waking. The reactor pulse increases, the lumens flare from dim red to a brighter, harsher crimson, and the address system screams. Not words, just a scream, raw and sustained, that serves the same function as a reveille horn. You wake, and you are immediately angry because the nails interpret the transition from sleep to wakefulness as a threat response, and for the first 10 minutes of every cycle, the entire ship is a powder keg of twitching, snarling, barely restrained violence. Fights break out in the barracks. People die. This is considered normal. Once the initial surge passes, the reavers assemble in the fighting pits for training. This is not optional. If you can hold a weapon, you train. The training is brutal and often lethal. We fight with dulled blades, but dull is a relative term, and the chirurgeons are always busy after the training sessions, stitching wounds and setting bones, and occasionally performing impromptu amputations with the same casual efficiency that a cook might use to debone a carcass. After training comes the feeding, then the watch, then the waiting. The food is functional, calorie-dense nutrient paste supplemented with whatever we took from the last engagement. I have eaten things that I will not describe. After eating, every able body is put to work maintaining the ship. I have spent hours crawling through maintenance shafts that have been warped by the Edict's slow mutation. The walls no longer smooth metal, but something ridged and organic, like the inside of a throat, carrying tools and replacement parts to tech thralls who work in conditions that would have violated every safety regulation in the Imperial Navy. And after the watch comes the waiting. The long hours between engagements, when there is nothing to do but sit and twitch and feel the nails chewing at the inside of your skull. The waiting is the hardest part. The nails are designed for combat. They flood your system with aggression and the sacred fury of the blood god, and when you are fighting, everything makes sense. You are a perfectly tuned instrument doing exactly what it was built to do. But when the fighting stops, the nails do not. They keep churning, keep demanding, keep whispering, kill, 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 into the base of your brain, and there is nothing to kill, and the frustration builds until you feel like your skull is going to crack open from the pressure. This is when people turn on each other. This is when the weak are culled, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because a ship full of Khornate berserkers with nothing to kill will eat itself alive if it does not find a target soon. Osek understands this. It is why he keeps the Edict moving, always hunting, always seeking the next engagement. We do not drift. We do not wait. We hunt. The Edict prowls the void like a predator, running patrol patterns through shipping lanes and trade routes, lurking near contested systems where Imperial Navy vessels are likely to be found, and striking with a speed and ferocity that catches even experienced captains off guard. Our preferred method is the ram. The Edict's prow has been reinforced with layered plates of salvaged armor and studded with great brass spikes that Osek claims were blessed by a demon prince whose name I am not permitted to speak. We close to ramming distance under full thrust, weathering whatever fire the enemy can bring to bear, and then we hit them. The impact is staggering. Even braced for it, even locked into boarding harnesses, the collision throws you off your feet and rattles your bones and makes your vision swim. And then the boarding ramps drop and the claws extend, and we pour through the breaches like blood from a wound, and the waiting is over, and the nails sing, and everything is red and simple and perfect. There is one more thing I should tell you about before I speak of the engagements. The rituals. Not the grand rituals that Osek conducts behind his sealed doors. The ones that make the deck plates vibrate, and the lumens flicker, and the thralls in the lower holds scream in their sleep. I mean the small rituals, the daily observances that bind the crew together and remind us, constantly and inescapably, of what we serve and what we have become. Every cycle, after the training and before the watch, the blood caller speaks. Her name is Idra Morvek, and she is perhaps the strangest person aboard the Wrathbound Edict, which is saying something given the company she keeps. Idra is not a warrior. She has never picked up an axe or a blade. She has never participated in a boarding action. She is thin to the point of emaciation, with a shaved skull covered in brands and tattoos that form a map of veins and arteries, so detailed and so anatomically precise that looking at her head is like looking at a medical diagram rendered in scar tissue. Her voice is the most remarkable thing about her. It is deep and resonant, far too deep for her narrow frame, as though someone had taken the voice of a much larger person and installed it in this skeletal woman. When she speaks, you listen. Not because the nails compel you, but because the sound of her voice does something to the air, thickens it, charges it, makes the hairs on your arms stand up, and the blood in your veins run hot. Idra conducts the rites of dedication. These are simple ceremonies, almost intimate compared to the grand bloodlettings that mark major engagements. The reavers gather in the fighting pit, shoulder to shoulder, and Idra stands in the center and she speaks. She tells us what Khorne demands. She describes the blood gods' wars in the realm beyond, the eternal campaigns against the other powers, the vast and incomprehensible battles that rage in dimensions we cannot perceive. She speaks of the Skull Throne and of the river of blood that flows at its base, fed by every death in every war across every world in the galaxy. She speaks of our place in that river, small tributaries flowing into a current that has been running since before humanity crawled out of its cradle on Terra and looked up at the stars with hungry eyes. And when she is finished, the dedication is made. Each reaver draws a blade across their palm and lets the blood fall onto the deck of the pit, and the metal drinks it. Not absorbs it, drinks it. You can see the blood sink into the surface, drawn downward by a force that is not gravity, disappearing into the fabric of the ship as though the edict herself is feeding. Because she is. The ship is as much a devotee of Khorne as any of us, and she has her own appetites, and we feed them with our blood, because that is the covenant. We give blood. The ship gives shelter and movement, and the ability to reach new prey. It is a transaction, honest in its brutality, and I have come to appreciate its clarity. I asked Idra once, during one of the lucid periods, whether she truly believed, whether the blood god was real, or whether the rituals were simply a mechanism of control, a way of keeping 2,000 berserkers focused and functional. She looked at me with eyes that were the color of old blood, and she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, "Belief is irrelevant. Khorne does not require belief. He requires blood. The river flows whether you believe in it or not. The Skull Throne grows whether you pray to it or not. The only question that matters is whether you will add to the river willingly, with purpose and pride, or whether you will be dragged into it screaming. Both are acceptable, but only one is beautiful. I think about that word sometimes. Beautiful. It is not a word you expect to hear aboard a Khornate warship, but Idra said it with absolute sincerity, and the worst part is that I think she was right. There is a beauty in what we do, a terrible, unforgivable beauty. The beauty of a blade at the apex of its swing, the beauty of absolute commitment to a single, pure purpose. It is the beauty of fire, which is breathtaking to behold and destroys everything it touches. The Chaurgians deserve mention as well, because they are the artisans of our transformation, and without them the edict would consume itself within a month. There are 4 of them aboard, something between surgeons and priests, their bodies modified with augmetic tools that fold out from their forearms like the appendages of some metallic insect. They maintain the nails. They install new ones in recruits deemed worthy. They treat wounds in ways that would horrify any Imperial medici. A broken bone is set without anesthetic because pain is an offering. A punctured lung is sealed with a heated blade. A severed limb is replaced with a crude augmetic that is more weapon than prosthetic. The Chaurgians do not heal. They repair. They optimize. And the patient, if they survive, is expected to use their rebuilt body to kill twice as efficiently as before. I report to the Chaurgians' bay every few cycles for nail maintenance. The implant sites become inflamed, and the crude metals corrode in the acidic environment of the skull. One of them opens my scalp and adjusts the hardware with tools that send spikes of white-hot pain through my skull. I do not scream, not because I am brave, but because the pain is so far beyond what screaming can express that the only response is silence. When it is over, the Chaurgian seals the incision with heated metal, and I stand and the nails sing with renewed clarity, and I go back to the fighting pits. I want to tell you what it looks like when the killing stops and nothing fills the space. There was a cycle between engagements when I found myself sitting in the mess bay with a reaver named Drek Sulin. I do not know his real name. Nobody does. We were eating nutrient paste from dented metal bowls, and the lights were flickering in the way they do when the edict is restless, and Drek was telling me about a dog he had owned as a child. Not a warhound. A dog. A small, brown, useless animal that had slept on his bed and followed him to the factorum gates every morning, and waited there until he came home. He told me how it died, which was of old age, which is the most extraordinary cause of death I have heard mentioned aboard this ship. And while he spoke, his hands were steady and his voice was flat, and the nails were quiet. And we could have been 2 men in any mess hall on any ship in the galaxy, eating a bad meal and talking about nothing. Then the address system screamed, and the nails surged, and Drek's eyes went hard and empty, and he stood and walked toward the fighting pits without another word. That was the most normal conversation I have had in years. I think about that dog sometimes. I think about it waiting by the factorum gates for a boy who would one day become something that would kill it without hesitation. But I was going to tell you about the engagements. Not all of them. There have been too many, and the nails have eaten the details of most, leaving only fragments, sensory snapshots that surface during the lucid periods like corpses floating up from deep water. But some I remember clearly because something about them burned through the red fog and imprinted itself on whatever passes for my memory. The first is the boarding of the Halcyon Temperance, an ecclesiarchy pilgrim vessel we intercepted in the Drethvain Reach, 6 months after the mutiny. She was enormous, a converted grand cruiser packed to overflowing with faithful pilgrims bound for some shrine world in the galactic north. 40,000 souls, unarmed, unescorted, carried through the void in a ship whose weapons had been removed and replaced with chapels and reliquaries and vast stained-glass viewports that depicted scenes from the life of the Emperor. She was the most beautiful ship I had ever seen, and we tore her apart like wolves tearing at the belly of a fallen grox. Osek did not want to board her. I remember that. He stood at the helm and looked at the augur readings, and I saw something cross his face that might have been contempt. Not for the pilgrims, for the act. He said, And I remember his exact words, because they were so unexpected. "There is no honor in this." And for a moment, I thought he would let them go, that the wrath-bound edict would turn away from this vast, defenseless target and seek worthier prey. But Khorne does not permit mercy, and the ship needed supplies, and the reavers were already howling in the boarding bays, their nails screaming for release after weeks without combat. And Osekich looked at the pilgrim ship on the view screen, and I saw him make the calculation, the cold, pragmatic weighing of necessity against principle. And he gave the order. "Bring us alongside, prepare boarding parties, take what we need and kill the rest." It was the first time I heard the blood god's name spoken like a curse rather than a prayer. The Halcyon Temperans had no real defenses, but even a ship without weapons can be a nightmare to board when it is packed to capacity with desperate human beings. We hit her in 3 places simultaneously, claws 1 and 2 punching through the cargo bays at the stern, while my group, claw 3, breached the main promenade deck amidships. The promenade was a vast vaulted space, 3 decks high, lined with devotional alcoves and shrines, and lit by thousands of candles that cast a warm, golden light across the polished stone floor. It was the most striking room I had ever set foot in. The ceiling was painted with a mural of the Emperor Ascendant, his golden form stretching from one end of the promenade to the other, his hands outstretched as though offering benediction to the faithful below. For a single, absurd heartbeat after the boarding ramp dropped, I stood at the breach and stared up at that painted face, and felt the weight of its gaze, and something cold moved through me, a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then the pilgrims came, not fighting at first, running, thousands of them surging down the promenade in a stampede of terror, crushing each other in their desperation to get away from the breach. The sound was indescribable, a wall of screaming and sobbing and prayer that hit us like a physical force. We advanced into it. We had to push through the press of bodies, our axes rising and falling in short, economical strokes, because there was no room for full swings. The crowd was too dense, the corridor too packed. The blood pooled ankle-deep on the polished stone within minutes. People were falling, being trampled by their own kind, and we walked over the fallen and the dying alike, our boots slipping in the wet. I remember the resistance tightening as we pushed deeper. Some pilgrims had armed themselves with pieces of the ship's fittings, brass candlesticks torn from the walls, lengths of chain from the sensors, even shards of the stained glass viewports that they had broken and were wielding like daggers, their hands sliced open by the edges of their own weapons, bleeding for the Emperor even as they tried to stop us from bleeding them for Khorne. They fought with the courage of the faithful, which is to say they fought with the courage of people who believed that death in service to their god was a passage to something better. I envied them that certainty. We cleared the promenade in 40 minutes. The stone floor was invisible beneath the dead. The golden light of the candles, those that still burned, reflected off the blood and gave the entire space a warm, amber glow that would have been beautiful if you did not look down. I remember a priest who threw holy water at me and seemed genuinely surprised when it did not burn. I remember an old woman who stood in a doorway with a kitchen knife and refused to move, and I went around her, not out of mercy, but because the corridor behind her was empty and there were living targets elsewhere. I remember a child. I will not tell you about the child. Some memories I will take to whatever grave awaits me. The deeper decks were harder. The pilgrims had barricaded themselves in the lower chapels, and the ship's few ordained clergy had organized them into something approaching a defensive formation, using the heavy stone pews as barriers and the narrow aisles between them as choke points. It was clever for civilians. It slowed us. One chapel in particular held out for over an hour, defended by a group of flagellants who had whipped themselves into a religious frenzy that was, if I am honest, not entirely unlike our own. They charged us with weighted chains and barbed flails, screaming hymns to the Emperor with the same ecstatic abandon that we screamed the name of Khorne, and for a few brutal minutes, the fighting in that chapel was as fierce as any engagement I have experienced. We lost 11 reavers in that single room. The flagellants died to the last, and not one of them asked for mercy. We stripped the halcyon temperance of everything useful: food stores, medical supplies, fuel, hull plating, weapons components salvaged from her decommissioned batteries, and bodies. Living bodies dragged screaming from their hiding places and herded into the edict's lower holds to serve as thralls. When we were finished, Osek ordered the wreck set adrift rather than destroyed. He said it would serve as a message. I think it served as something else. I think it was penance. Osek Dravanthir, Chaos Lord, World Eater, servant of the Blood God, looked at what we had done to a ship full of unarmed pilgrims and felt something that he would never admit to feeling, and setting the wreck adrift instead of destroying it was his way of acknowledging that something had been lost. Some line had been crossed that should not have been crossed even by men like us. Between the temperance and what came next, there were other boardings, dozens of them. Cargo haulers, ore barges, fuel transports, the unglamorous logistical spine of the Imperium that most citizens never think about. But one stands out because it was the first time we faced something other than human defenders, and because it taught me that there are things in this galaxy that can make a Khornate reaver hesitate. We caught the vessel at the edge of the Morvac Nebula. She was not Imperial. Her hull was smooth and pale, organic-looking, with none of the brutal angularity of human construction. Her lines were clean and flowing, and she moved through the void with a grace that made every Imperial warship I had ever served on look like a brick thrown through water. She was a warship of the Tau Empire, a vessel class I had never seen before, though I later learned the Imperials designate them as Castellan-class escorts. She was alone, separated from her fleet by what I can only assume was a navigational error or warp turbulence, and she was limping, one of her engine clusters dark and trailing a thin streamer of plasma that glittered in the nebula's light like a thread of spun gold. Osek ordered the attack without hesitation. The Tau are not Khorne's preferred enemy. They fight at range, relying on technology and precision rather than strength and fury, and their refusal to engage in close combat is seen by many Khornate warriors as cowardice of the most contemptible kind. But a kill is a kill, and the Edict needed supplies, and so we ran her down. The Tau vessel fought well from a distance, her weapon system scoring hits on our hull that burned with a clean, white heat entirely unlike the dirty orange of Imperial munitions. Their technology was remarkable. Pulse rounds that tracked our movement and adjusted trajectory mid-flight. Shield projections that we had to punch through before our own weapons could connect. But she was wounded and alone, and we were the wrath-bound Edict, and when we finally closed to boarding distance and rammed our claws into her pale, smooth hull, I felt the nails surge and the fury drown out every other thought. And I stopped thinking about the elegance of her design and started thinking about what was inside. The interior of a Tau vessel is nothing like an Imperial ship. The corridors are wide and clean and lit by a diffuse blue-white light that comes from the walls themselves, rather than from discrete lumen units. The air smelled different, filtered and processed to a degree that made Imperial atmosphere recyclers seem primitive. Everything was smooth, rounded, free of the exposed piping and bare metal and grime that characterize human warships. It felt wrong. It felt like fighting inside a hospital or a laboratory, sterile and precise and utterly alien. And the defenders were unlike anything I had faced before. The fire warriors met us at the breach, with a discipline that I can only describe as mechanical. They did not panic. They did not scream. They did not pray. They simply formed a line, knelt, and opened fire with a coordinated volley that cut down the first 8 reavers through the breach in less than 2 seconds. Pulse rifle fire. I had heard about it in briefings during my Navy days, but never experienced it firsthand. Each round was a tiny sun, a bolt of superheated plasma that burned through our salvaged armor like it was cloth and left wounds that were cauterized instantly, neat round holes punched through flesh and bone with a clinical precision that was the antithesis of everything Khorne represents. There was no mess, no splatter, no spraying arterial blood. Just clean, efficient killing, and the wrongness of it, the sterility, enraged the reavers even further. We lost 30 people taking that first corridor. The Tau fell back in perfect order, leapfrogging by fire teams, each team covering the withdrawal of the one behind it with overlapping fields of fire that turned every intersection into a killing ground. They did not waste ammunition. They did not miss. Every shot was aimed and every shot hit something, and for the first time since the mutiny, I understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a boarding action, to be the one dying in a corridor while the enemy advanced with relentless mechanical efficiency. It was the closest I have come to admiring an enemy since I left the Imperial Navy. The Tau fought the way Lieutenant Commander Prek would have wanted his arms men to fight, with discipline and precision, and not a single wasted motion. We overwhelmed them eventually. We always do. Discipline and precision cannot stand against the sheer fury of 200 Khornate reavers, who do not care if they die as long as they can close the distance. We closed it. I lost my axe in the chest of a fire warrior and killed the next one with my hands. The Tau broke when we reached their command deck. When we finally reached the ship's commander, a Tau in ornate armor who carried a long-bladed weapon with the poise of a fencer, Vorek killed him in single combat. It lasted 11 seconds. The Tau was fast, faster than any human, but Vorek is not human and has not been for 10 millennia, and the commander's skill meant nothing against a world eater who had been honing his craft since before the Tau had discovered fire. We stripped the ship and left her spinning in the nebula. The second engagement I want to tell you about is the one that changed everything, the one that revealed the truth about why the Wrath-bound Edict exists and what Osek Dravanthir is really doing. 8 months after the Halcyon Temperance, we intercepted an Imperial Navy convoy in the Thelfrost system, a cluster of dead worlds orbiting a dying star that had been used as a naval waypoint for centuries. The convoy consisted of 3 transport ships escorted by a pair of frigates and a light cruiser. Standard formation, standard composition, the kind of target we had hit a dozen times before. Osek gave the order to engage, and we ran in under full thrust, the prow lance batteries tearing into the escorts, while the helmsman lined us up for a ramming approach on the lead transport. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. And then the light cruiser turned toward us and accelerated, and her identification beacons flared to life, and I saw the name on the auger readout and felt something that the nails could not suppress. Her name was the Vigilant Constance, and she flew the colors of Battlefleet Corinthus. The same battlefleet that the Scythian Resolve had served with, the same battlefleet that I had served with. I did not know the ship. She was a Dauntless-class light cruiser, too small and too new to have been part of our squadron. But the colors, the fleet identification codes, the heraldry painted on her hull, those I knew, those I had worn on my own uniform, those I had saluted every day for 11 years, and seeing them here now, on a ship that was charging toward us with her lance batteries blazing and her crew manning their guns with the same disciplined efficiency that I had once been trained in. Something inside me fractured. Not broke. Fractured. A hairline crack running through the structure of the thing I had become. The thing that Khorne had built in the ruins of Rendahl Caeve. And through that crack, like light through a fissure in a wall, the old Rendahl looked out and saw what was coming, and screamed. We boarded the vigilant Constance. Of course we did. That is what we do. The edict rammed her amidships, and we poured through the breach into corridors that smelled and sounded and felt like home. The smell hit me first, recycled air, with that specific metallic tang that is unique to Imperial Navy warships, the mixture of machine oil and disinfectant, and the faint, ever-present undercurrent of human sweat that no filtration system can entirely remove. I knew that smell. I had breathed it for 11 years. And breathing it now, on the wrong side of a boarding action, with an axe in my hand and blood on my face, was like walking into a room where you used to live and finding it occupied by strangers. The defenders were Corinthus trained, and Corinthus armsmen are taught to fight in confined spaces the way most soldiers are taught to march. They had set up a 3-tier defense anchored on the main lateral corridor. The first tier was a heavy weapons emplacement at the main junction, 2 crew-served heavy stubbers behind a barricade of welded deck plates, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that covered the entire width of the corridor. The second tier was a squad of armsmen with combat shotguns, staggered in the alcoves and maintenance hatches along the walls, ready to pour enfilade fire into anyone who got past the stubbers. The third tier was a reserve force, 10 men with boarding shields and shock mauls, positioned at the next junction back, ready to countercharge if we broke through. It was textbook. I knew because I had been taught from the same textbook. The heavy stubbers opened up as we came around the first bend, and the corridor became a tunnel of tracers and shredded metal. The first wave of reavers simply disintegrated. The second wave hit the same wall of fire and fared no better. We should have died, all of us. The defense was perfect, but the nails do not permit withdrawal, and so we kept coming. Wave after wave, climbing over the dead, throwing ourselves at the barricade, with a fury beyond rational thought. I was in the 4th wave. By the time I reached the killing ground, the corridor floor was so thick with bodies that I was running on the dead rather than the deck. The heavy stubbers were overheating, their barrels glowing cherry red, the rate of fire slowing. That was the moment. The gap. I cleared the barricade by going over it. I threw myself at the welded plates and scrabbled up and over with a strength that was not entirely my own. One of the stubber crew swung his weapon toward me, but the barrel was too hot to aim accurately, and the burst went wide. I hit him with the axe before he could correct, a downward stroke that split him from collarbone to sternum, and then I was behind the barricade and among the second-tier defenders, and the corridor became a charnel house. The shotgun armsmen stood their ground and fired point-blank into the reavers pouring over the barricade. I took a slug in the left shoulder that spun me half around and numbed my arm. I took another in the hip that would have shattered the pelvis of the man I used to be, but glanced off the thickened bone that Khorne's gifts had given me. And I kept moving, because the nails translate pain into something that feels like fuel, and the more you are wounded, the harder you fight. I killed 4 armsmen in that corridor, each one wearing the uniform I used to wear. The 4th, a young woman with the insignia of a section corporal, managed to press her shotgun muzzle against my stomach before I caught her wrist. The gun discharged into the wall beside us, close enough to scorch my side, and I ended it with a headbutt that caved in her faceplate and the face behind it. The reserve force broke after that. Their section leader, a gray-haired man with a scar across his chin, held his position until the last of his people had withdrawn. then turned and fought alone against 3 reavers, his shock maul crackling as he swung it in made desperate arcs. He was good, very good. I killed him anyway because the nails demanded it, and the old Rendahl had stopped being loud enough to hear. We took the Constance deck by deck after that, fighting through a ship that mirrored the Scythian resolve in 100 small, agonizing ways. The mess hall, the armory where weapons were racked in the same pattern I had been trained to maintain, the barracks where bunks were arranged in rows of 8, just like mine, just like Torsen's. Every room was a memory that the axe could not silence. It was on the vigilant Constance that I found the orders. Not their orders, our orders, or rather the pattern behind our orders, the design that I had been too blinded by blood and fury to see. While the rest of the boarding party was clearing the lower decks, I found myself on the bridge, alone. The lucidity had come, sudden and jarring, the way it sometimes does after an intense engagement, as though the nails need a moment to recharge before they can resume their screaming. I was standing on the bridge of a dying Imperial warship, surrounded by the bodies of her crew, and I was briefly, terribly lucid. And I saw the navigational charts that the Constance had been carrying, charts of the Rendahl passage, the same warp corridor where the Scythian resolve had fallen. And marked on those charts, in the precise hand of an Imperial cartographer, were warnings. Anomaly detected, warp current unstable, suspected chaos incursion point, do not traverse without escort. The dates on those warnings predated our transit. The Imperial Navy had known. They had known that the Rendahl passage was compromised, and they had let the Scythian resolve transit anyway. Maybe it was incompetence. Maybe the warnings had not reached the right people in time. Or maybe, and this is the thought that coils in my gut like a serpent, maybe someone had decided that 1 lunar-class cruiser and 4,000 souls was an acceptable price to pay for intelligence on the nature of the threat. I do not know. I will never know. But the possibility that my fall, that the deaths of Torsen and Kira and everyone else aboard the Resolve was not an accident, but a calculation. A line item in some admiral's strategic assessment. The thought has a weight to it that even the nails cannot lift. And here is the thing I need you to understand, because this is where the story turns and does not turn back. When I read those charts, standing on the bridge of the Constance with the blood of her crew on my boots, I did not feel grief. What I felt was anger, real anger. Not the synthetic fury of the nails, not the mindless red surge that comes with combat, but a cold, clear, deliberate hatred that I recognized as entirely my own. The Imperium had thrown us away, had fed us to the warp like scraps to a dog. And every Aquila I had knelt before, every prayer I had murmured to a god-emperor who sat on a throne while his admirals spent human lives like currency, all of it had been a lie. Not the lie that chaos tells, which is a lie dressed as truth. The lie that the Imperium tells, which is a truth dressed as love. I felt that hatred settle into my bones, and I knew that this was not the nails and this was not Khorne. This was mine. This was Rendahl Caeve, choosing to hate, and the choice fed the blood god more sweetly than any kill I had ever made. Because Khorne does not need to lie to you. He does not need to seduce you or trick you. All he needs is for the Imperium to give you a reason, and the Imperium always does. But that was not the real discovery. The real discovery came later, in the weeks after the Constance, when I began to watch Osekak more carefully. The fracture in my loyalty, the hairline crack that the Corinthus colors had opened, let me see things that I had been blind to before. And what I saw was a pattern. Every engagement, every boarding action, every kill was not random. Osek was not simply hunting for supplies and slaughter. He was collecting. Every ship we boarded, Osek would disappear into the depths of the captured vessel and emerge carrying something. Artifacts, relics, fragments of metal or bone or crystal that pulsed with a heat I could feel from across the room. He kept them in his quarters, in a vault that no mortal was permitted to enter, and sometimes, in the deep hours of the cycle when the ship was quiet, I would pass his door and hear sounds from within. Not speech, not prayer, something older and deeper, a rhythmic chanting in a language that predated humanity, that predated the galaxy, that came from the place where Khorne sits on his throne and stares into the infinite with eyes made of murder. Osek was building something, or summoning something, or both. The boarding actions, the kills, the blood, all of it was fuel for a ritual that spanned years, maybe decades, a slow accretion of death and suffering that was not random violence, but a deliberate, methodical working toward a goal that Osek had never shared with anyone. The wrath-bound edict was not a raider. It was an altar, and every ship we boarded, every crew we slaughtered, every skull we took was an offering laid upon that altar in service of a purpose that I could not see but could feel, the way you can feel the approach of a storm before the first drop of rain falls. I confronted him. I do not know what possessed me to do it. Maybe the fracture from the constants was wider than I thought. Maybe the lucidity that had been coming in shorter and shorter bursts had crystallized just once into something approaching courage. Or maybe the nails had malfunctioned just slightly, just enough to let the old Rendahl seize control for a few terrifying minutes. Whatever the reason, I stood in the corridor outside his quarters, and I spoke, and I said, "What are you building?" I did not shout. I did not accuse. I asked the way a child asks, with genuine confusion and a desperate need to understand. Osek did not kill me. That was the first surprise. He looked at me with those ember-colored eyes, and he was silent for a long time, and then he said, "The blood god does not sit idle on his throne. He wages war against powers you cannot comprehend, and sometimes he reaches into the materium and builds a door, a wound in the skin of reality through which his legions can pour. Every skull we take is a brick in that door. Every drop of blood is the mortar. And when the door is complete, something will come through that will make everything we have done look like children playing with sticks. And on that day, Rendahl Caeve, you will understand why you were chosen, why the whisper found you, why the rage felt like a homecoming. You were born with a hole in your soul, and that hole was shaped like a key, and the door is almost finished. I want to tell you that I rejected this, that I turned and walked away and began planning my escape. But I did not. I stood there feeling the weight of his words settle over me, and I felt the fracture seal itself, not because I was convinced, but because the alternative was too vast and too terrible to hold. The understanding that I had been manipulated from the very beginning, that my fall was not a tragedy, but a plan, that the hole in my soul was not a flaw, but a feature designed and exploited by a god of war. That understanding would have unmade me entirely, and so I let it go. I let the rage fill the space where the understanding had been. I let the nails resume their screaming, and I went back to the fighting pits, and I trained and I tried very hard not to think about doors. But thoughts are like blood. They find a way through. The mutation started in the months after the temperance. I noticed the first one during a training session in the pits when my sparring partner caught me across the forearm with a blade that should have opened me to the bone. Instead, the blade skidded off my skin with a sound like metal scraping stone. I looked down and saw that the skin of my forearm had changed. It was still skin, technically, but it had thickened and darkened, taking on a rough, almost scaled texture that reminded me of the hide of the grox beasts that were used as draft animals on Pelgranith. I stared at it for a long time, flexing my fingers, watching the scales shift and catch the light, and I felt nothing. No surprise, no horror. As though some part of me had been expecting this, as though the change was not a corruption but a completion, the next logical step in a process that had begun the moment the whisper found me in the dark. More changes followed. My teeth grew longer and sharper, enough that I had to learn to eat differently. My eyes shifted from brown to a deep, burnt amber that glowed faintly in low light. The muscles of my back and shoulders thickened beneath the scaled skin until I could no longer fit into my armor and had to have new pieces forged. My reflexes quickened, my endurance increased. I could fight for hours without tiring, could take wounds that would have killed me a year ago and keep moving. Khorne was remaking me, slowly, deliberately, the way a smith reshapes raw iron into a blade. And I let him. That is the truth that the lucid moments force me to confront. At every stage of the transformation, I could have fought. I could have resisted. But I did not. Because the mutations made me stronger, and strength is currency aboard the edict. And the stronger I became, the more I killed. And the more I killed, the better I felt. The alternative was feeling the emptiness, feeling the ghost of Torsena's snoring, and Gyra's hand on my shoulder, and the word Rendahl spoken with pity by a dead woman. The mutations were not a curse. They were armor. Another layer of insulation between the thing I had become and the memory of the thing I had been. Thren Voshka changed too. We all did. But Thren changed faster and more dramatically than most, and watching her transformation was like watching my own in a distorted mirror. Her skin turned the color of an old bruise, dark purple mottled with red, and her hands elongated, the fingers stretching until they were almost arachnid, tipped with nails that had hardened into something indistinguishable from claws. She stopped speaking, not all at once, but gradually, the words draining out of her over the course of weeks, until what was left was a creature that communicated in growls and snarls, and a high, keening sound that I came to recognize as contentment. She was further along the path than I was. The nails had consumed more of her, or she had given more of herself to the rage, and what remained was less a person and more a weapon with legs. I pitied her. The irony of that is not lost on me. A monster pitying a greater monster. But in the lucid moments when I could still remember what pity was, I looked at Thren and I saw my future, and I was afraid. There is something else I need to tell you. Something that I have been avoiding because speaking it aloud makes it real in a way that thinking about it does not. The voice, not the whisper from the Nethraval passage. Something different. Something that began after the mutations started, a voice that speaks to me in the moments between waking and sleep, when the nails are quiet and the rage has retreated and I am as close to my old self as I will ever be. It speaks in low Gothic, which surprises me, because I would expect a god's voice to use a grander language. It speaks simply and clearly and with a warmth that I find more disturbing than any amount of screaming. It calls me son. It tells me that I am doing well. It tells me that it is proud of me. It tells me that the door is almost finished and that when it opens, I will be standing at the threshold, and I will be the first to see what lies on the other side, and it will be glorious. And the worst part, the part that makes me press this Vox recorder against my mouth and speak faster, as though I can outrun the truth by turning it into words, is that when the voice speaks, I feel loved. Not the love of a parent or a friend or a lover. Something vaster and more terrible. The love of a god for his instrument. The love of a fire for the fuel it consumes. I do not want to be loved by Khorne, but I am no longer certain that what I want matters. Before I tell you about the end, there is one more boarding I must describe, because it was the only time I have ever seen the wrath-bound edict come close to losing, and because it taught me what true warriors look like when they are defending their ship. and the lesson left scars that go deeper than anything the nails have carved. We caught the strike cruiser Unyielding Wrath in the Golvex Drift, a graveyard of dead ships orbiting a collapsed star. She was a space marine vessel bearing the heraldry of the Hollow Sentinels, a chapter Wawan had never heard of, but whose reputation, I would learn later, was built on void warfare and ship-to-ship combat. She was damaged, limping on half power after what appeared to have been an engagement with an Orc raider squadron, her starboard weapons batteries dark, and her hull scarred with the distinctive scorching of Orc weapons fire. Osek saw an opportunity. A wounded space marine vessel, alone, separated from her fleet, her complement presumably depleted. Easy prey. He was wrong. Nothing about the Unyielding Wrath was easy. We rammed her in the standard fashion, the Edict's reinforced prow punching through her weakened starboard hull and lodging deep in her midsection. The boarding claws deployed, and we poured through the breach, 500 reavers and 3 of Osek's Astar Tess, expecting to find the same disorganized resistance we always found, the same panicked defenders scrambling to respond to a sudden breach in their hull. What we found instead was a kill box. The Space Marines had known we were coming. They had seen us on their augurs, had read our approach vector, had calculated our ram point, and had prepared the breach zone with the cold, methodical precision of warriors who had been fighting boarding actions for centuries. The corridor beyond the breach had been cleared of everything, every piece of equipment, every fitting, every obstruction that might have provided cover. The walls had been scored with deep grooves that channeled movement into a single narrow lane. And at the end of that lane, in a space that was barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast, stood 4 Space Marines in full battle plate. 4. That is all. 4 Adeptus Astar Tess in the deep teal armor of the Hollow Sentinels, each one carrying a storm bolter and a combat blade the length of my arm. They did not shout. They did not taunt. They did not offer surrender terms or deliver ultimatums. They simply stood and waited, and when the first reavers came screaming down the lane, they opened fire. A storm bolter is not like a human weapon. The rounds are explosive, each one a miniature rocket that detonates on impact, and at the rate of fire a storm bolter delivers, the effect is less like being shot and more like being caught in a continuous explosion. The first 50 reavers died in under 10 seconds, not wounded, not incapacitated, destroyed, torn apart by mass reactive rounds that punched through salvaged armor and mutated flesh alike, detonating inside the body and converting each target into a wet red starburst of fragmented bone and shredded tissue. The corridor became impassable, choked with the dead, and still we came, climbing over the fallen, and the Space Marines adjusted their aim with inhuman precision and kept firing, and still we came, and they kept firing, and the pile of dead grew higher, and the blood ran in rivers down the scored channels in the walls, and I understood with a clarity that cut through even the nails that we were being harvested. It took Vorek to break the deadlock. He came through the breach like a comet, his ancient Terminator plate scarred and dented, his chainaxe screaming, and he hit the kill box at a full sprint, vaulting the pile of dead with a single, impossible leap that carried him over the heads of the reavers and into the space where the Hollow Sentinels stood. What followed was the most savage display of close-quarters combat I have ever witnessed. 5 Space Marines, 4 Sentinels, and 1 World Eater, fighting in a space barely large enough for one of them, their weapons moving at speeds that my eyes could barely track. Vorek killed 2 of them in the first exchange, his chainaxe finding the gap between Gorget and Helm on the first and the joint between Pauldron and Vambrace on the second. The 3rd Sentinel put a combat blade through Vorek's thigh, piercing the ceramite and the transhuman muscle beneath, and Forek ripped the blade free and used it to open the sentinel's throat. The fourth fought a retreating action, falling back through a hatchway that he sealed behind him, and Forek stood in the kill box, bleeding from a dozen wounds, surrounded by the bodies of the hollow sentinels and the hundreds of reavers they had killed, and he raised his chainaxe and he screamed, not a battle cry, but a sound of pure exultation, the sound of a predator that has found prey worthy of the hunt. The rest of the boarding was brutal. The hollow sentinels had perhaps 30 Astar tests aboard, and every one of them fought like they were worth 100 men. Every corridor was a trap. Every hatchway was wired. They used the ship's internal systems against us, venting atmosphere, flooding corridors with coolant, overloading power conduits to create walls of electrical discharge. We lost 300 reavers taking that ship. 300 against 30. And when we finally reached the bridge, the chapter's captain, a giant even by Astar Tess standards, fought Osekik himself for 6 minutes. The captain of the Hollow Sentinels fought with a skill that would have honored any servant of the Blood God, and when Osek finally brought him down, splitting his helm with a blow that cracked the deck plate beneath them, the Chaos Lord stood over his fallen enemy and said that one earned his skull. The skull now hangs at the center of the prow shrine, given pride of place among the offerings. We lost 300 reavers and one of Osek's Astar Tess, a warrior called Threvek, who had served the Blood God for 6,000 years, and who was killed by a plasma blast that melted through his armor and the body within in a single blinding flash. 301 dead to take a damaged ship crewed by 30 space marines. That is the arithmetic of fighting the Adeptus Astar Tess. And the nails, for once, were quiet in the aftermath, not because the fury had been spent, but because even the implants recognized that what we had witnessed was something sacred. Not sacred in the way of the ecclesiarchy, sacred in the way that Khorne understands. Strength against strength, skill against skill, death met and given in equal measure. Let me tell you about the last engagement, the one that brought me here, to this ruined orbital station, crouching in the dark with a Vox recorder and the fading remnants of my humanity. The one that proved Osek's words true and showed me what was behind the door. We had been hunting for 3 cycles without finding a target. The void around us was empty, a vast stretch of nothing between the Drethvain Reach and the trailing edge of the Morvok Nebula, where the stars thin out and the darkness between them grows thick enough to feel. The crew was on edge. The nails were screaming louder than usual, and the fighting pits were claiming 6-7 lives per cycle. 2 reavers had killed each other in the barracks over a dispute that no one could remember the cause of. Thren Voshka had stopped eating entirely and spent her waking hours crouched in a corner of the boarding bay, rocking back and forth, her clawed hands opening and closing with a rhythmic precision that reminded me of a heartbeat. Even the Astar Tess were restless. I saw Vorek pacing the upper decks, his hands clenching and unclenching on the haft of his chainaxe, the scar where Prek's last bolt had struck, glinting in the dim light. The edict herself seemed agitated, the deck vibrations shifting to a higher frequency, the walls of the lower corridors sweating a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of hot metal and something else, something alive. And then the augers lit up, and everything changed. The target was an Imperial battleship, not a cruiser, not a frigate, a full battleship, an Overlord-class behemoth named the Throne Perpetual, bristling with weapons and carrying a crew complement of over 100,000 souls. She was escorted by 4 destroyers and a pair of frigates, a full battle group that should have been more than enough to swat us out of the void like an insect. I stood on the observation deck and watched the auger display, watched the vast shape of the throne perpetual resolve itself out of the static, and I felt two things simultaneously: the nails screaming with anticipation, and the old Rendahl, deep inside, whispering that this was suicide, that Osek had finally lost his mind, that even the blood god's favor could not carry a single cruiser against a battleship and its escorts. But Osek did not attack immediately. For the first time in my memory, he hesitated, not out of fear. I saw his face in the red light of the command deck, and there was no fear there. What I saw was anticipation, the same expression I had seen on the face of a man kneeling before the altar in the fighting pit, about to make an offering. Osek was not looking at a target. He was looking at the final piece, the last brick, the capstone of a ritual that had been building for years, written in blood across the hulls of 100 shattered ships, and the throne perpetual, with her 100,000 souls, was the offering that would complete it. He turned to the bridge crew and he spoke, and his voice was different. As though there were two voices speaking in perfect unison, Osek's low baritone and something else beneath it, something that vibrated at a frequency that made the blood itch and the nails fall silent, actually silent, for the first time since they had been hammered into my skull. He said, "This is the day." He said, "The door is ready, and the key is in our hands, and when it opens, you will see the face of the god." And then, impossibly, he smiled. I had never seen Osek Dravanthier smile. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. We attacked the throne perpetual at full ramming speed. Void shields dropped to channel every erg of energy to thrust. The escorts opened fire. Lance beams and macro cannon shells slammed into our hull, and the edict shuddered and screamed, her superstructure buckling under impacts that would have gutted a lesser vessel. I was in boarding claw 3, packed in with my reavers, the harness cutting into my shoulders as the ship bucked and heaved. We were being destroyed. The edict was dying around us. And then we hit. The impact was beyond description. The edict's reinforced prow struck the throne perpetual's hull at a velocity that turned both ships' forward sections into a single mass of crumpled, intertwined metal, fused together in an embrace of mutual destruction. The shockwave snapped my harness and sent me tumbling until I fetched up against the boarding ramp with an impact that should have broken my spine. It did not. The mutations had done their work. I was on my feet before the ringing stopped, axe in hand, the nails roaring back to life with a fury that eclipsed anything I had felt before. The ramp dropped and we charged into the guts of the throne perpetual. The first thing I registered was scale. This was not a cruiser or a frigate. This was a battleship, and her corridors were built to match, wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast, high enough that the ceiling disappeared into shadow, lined with support columns as thick as tree trunks that created a forest of metal through which the defenders had established their positions, and they were waiting for us. A battleship carries over 100,000 crew, and the Throne Perpetual's captain had used that manpower to create a defense in depth that made the Vigilant Constance's preparations look like a barricade of children's toys. The first barrier was a wall of ogrin, abhuman brutes in flak armor, carrying ripper guns and improvised clubs. Behind them stood 3 ranks of armsmen with las guns. Behind the armsmen, a line of naval security officers in carapace armor with hell guns. And behind all of them, visible through the gaps in the formation, a battle servitor cohort, half-mechanical things with built-in heavy weapons where their arms should have been, their dead eyes scanning the breach with the cold patience of machines. The Ogreen hit us like a wall of meat. Each one stood nearly 3 meters tall, and their ripper guns fired volleys of shot that turned the air into a blizzard of metal. But the real threat was their bulk. They clogged the corridor, their massive bodies forming a living barricade that our reavers crashed against like waves against a breakwater. I saw a reaver leap at an ogryn and be swatted out of the air like an insect. I saw another get caught by a ripper gun blast at point-blank range and simply evaporate from the waist up. The ogryn were laughing. They were enjoying this, and for a strange moment I felt a kinship with them, because they understood something the armsmen behind them did not, that close-quarters killing is its own reward. We broke through the ogryn line by sheer weight of numbers, swarming over them like ants overwhelming a larger predator, hacking at legs and groins and the gaps between their armor plates until the giants toppled and were buried under a pile of screaming, stabbing reavers. The armsmen behind opened fire as the ogryn fell, and the corridor became a hellscape of lass fire and blood. I caught a lass bolt across the cheek that burned a furrow in the scaled skin and left the smell of cooked meat in my nostrils. I took another in the thigh that punched clean through and out the other side, a neat cauterized hole that should have dropped me but did not, because the mutations had threaded my muscles with fibers that contracted around wounds and sealed them like living tourniquets. We fought through 4 defensive positions in the first hour, leaving a trail of dead that stretched from the breach point to the main transit corridor. The Throne Perpetual's defenders fought well, but they were mortal men facing something that was no longer entirely mortal, and the mathematics of the engagement were against them. For every reaver they killed, 2 more came through the breach, an endless tide of howling, bleeding, nail-driven fury that crashed against their lines and eroded them the way water erodes stone. Not with a single blow, but with relentless, ceaseless pressure. It was in the 5th hour that reality began to change. The lumens started pulsing in a rhythm that matched a heartbeat. The air grew hot, then oppressively hot. The walls began to sweat a dark, viscous fluid that pulsed under my fingers and left faint, reddish sigils on my skin before they faded. And then the corridor ahead was wrong. The walls were not metal. They were flesh, red and glistening, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. The floor was slick with blood that seeped up from the deck plates as though the ship itself were bleeding from the inside. The air tasted of copper, and in the distance, at the end of a corridor that stretched impossibly far, I could see a light, brass-colored, pulsing, warm. The door. I ran toward it. We all did. Not because we chose to, but because the light called to us the way the whisper had called to us in the Nethraval passage, and our bodies responded before our minds could object. Thran Voshka was beside me, running on all 4s now, her body contorted into something that was barely recognizable as human, a lean, purple-skinned predator that moved with a fluid, horrible grace. The reavers were howling, not battle cries, but something else, something wordless and primal, the sound of creatures answering a summons that predated language. And behind us, above us, moving through the ruined superstructure of both ships with the casual power of a god walking through a garden, came Osek Dravanthir, his ancient armor stained with the blood of 10,000 years of war, his chainaxe idle at his side, his eyes fixed on the light at the end of the corridor. We met resistance along the way. Imperial armsmen who had been caught in the transformation, their bodies twisted by the warp incursion, their eyes wide with a terror so profound that it had transcended fear and become a kind of blank, animal incomprehension. Some fought. Most simply stood and screamed. We killed them all. I do not remember the details. The nails were at a pitch I had never experienced before. a sustained shrieking crescendo that obliterated every thought, every memory, every shred of the old Rendahl, until all that remained was the axe and the killing and the light growing brighter and closer with every step. And then we reached it. The door was not a door. It was a wound, a tear in reality, a ragged gash in the fabric of the materium that opened onto something that I cannot describe because my mind was not built to process what it saw. Colors that do not exist in the visible spectrum, geometries that violate the laws of physics. A sky that was not a sky, but a ceiling made of swords, endless blades stretching to an impossible horizon, and beneath that sky a plain of brass and bone that extended in every direction, and on that plain armies. Not thousands, not millions. Legions beyond counting, demons of war and fury and slaughter, rank upon rank of them, their forms wreathed in fire and hatred, and above them all, above everything, the shadow of something so vast that it did not have a shape, only a presence, a weight, a gravitational pull that was not physical but spiritual, dragging at the core of my being with a force that made the whisper, the nails, the voice that called me son, seem like a candle flame beside a sun. Khorne, not a metaphor, not a symbol, not a theological abstraction. The blood god himself in the howling, impossible flesh of his divine reality, looking out through the door that Osek had built with the blood of 100 ships, and for one fraction of one heartbeat seeing me, knowing me, acknowledging me. And in that acknowledgement was everything Osek had promised: purpose, belonging, an end to the emptiness that had haunted me since before I was born, the hole in my soul, shaped like a key, finding its lock at last. I understood. In that moment I understood everything. Why the whisper had come, why I had not fought it, why the rage felt like a homecoming. I had been made for this. Every moment of my life, from the foundries of Pelgranith, to the corridors of the Scythian Resolve, to the bloody decks of the wrath-bound Edict, had been a journey toward this threshold, and I was here and the door was open, and all I had to do was step through. I did not step through. I do not know why. The nails were silent. Osek was already at the threshold, his arms raised, his voice raised in a hymn that shook the walls and made the brass plane beyond tremble. The reavers were pouring through in a screaming tide, their mortal shells burning away like paper in a furnace, and what emerged on the other side was not human, had never been human, had merely been wearing humanity like a costume until the moment when the curtain rose and the real performance began. And then Thren stepped forward. She was beside me. I had not noticed her, which tells you how far gone I was, because Thren Voshka in her current form was not something you could fail to notice. She was barely recognizable. The purple-skinned, claw-fingered thing she had become stood at the threshold, and she paused. For one heartbeat she paused, and she turned her head and looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had not seen there in months. Recognition. Not the animal awareness of a packmate. Recognition. She knew me. She knew where we were and what was about to happen, and in that fragment of a second, the thing that had been Thren Voshka was looking out through the shell of the creature she had become, the way the old Rendahl sometimes looked out through mine. She opened her mouth, and I thought she was going to speak, and I wanted her to speak. I wanted it more than I had wanted anything since the whisper first found me, because if she could still speak, then she was still in there, still a person, still someone I could hold on to as proof that the transformation was not total, that something survived. She did not speak. She made a sound, a low, keening note that I had heard her make 100 times in the barracks and the boarding bays, the sound I had learned to recognize as contentment. And then she stepped through the door, and I watched her dissolve. Not all at once. The skin went first, sloughing away like ash from a burning log, and beneath it was something red and raw and reshaping itself with every step. Her arms lengthened, her spine curved, her face stretched into a configuration that was no longer a face but a weapon, a thing of teeth and angles and hunger. And the keening sound continued, rising in pitch, becoming something joyful, ecstatic, as though the dissolution was not destruction but release, as though the thing emerging from the ruin of Threnvoshka was what she had always been underneath, and the human part was just the chrysalis. The last thing I saw before the light swallowed her was her hands, those elongated, claw-tipped hands, reaching forward, reaching toward the brass plane and the armies and the shadow of the god, reaching with a yearning so naked and so absolute that it looked like worship. And then she was gone. And what stood on the other side was not Thren, was not anyone, was a demon, newborn and screaming, and it did not look back. I watched that. I watched every second of it. And something inside me, something beneath the nails and the mutations and the rage and the hatred I had chosen on the bridge of the Constance, looked at what Thren had become and said, no. And I stood at the threshold and I did not move. There was no voice telling me to stop, no moment of moral clarity, no last-second redemption. What stopped me was Thren. What I had just watched happen to her, the way her eyes had cleared for that one heartbeat, the way she had looked at me with something that was still recognizably a person, and then the way that person had been peeled away, layer by layer, as she crossed. I had seen what was on the other side of the door. Not just the brass plane and the legions and the shadow of the god. I had seen what the door does to the ones who walk through it. It takes everything, not just the flesh, not just the mind. Everything. The rage, the hatred, the reasons. The demon that had been Thren did not remember why she killed. It did not hate the Imperium. It did not mourn its lost humanity. It did not choose. It simply was. A thing of teeth and fury, perfectly empty, perfectly obedient, with no self left to disobey. And I understood, standing there at the threshold with the light of a god's domain burning my skin, that if I stepped through, I would lose the one thing that was still mine. Not a memory, not a conscience. My hatred. The cold, deliberate, chosen hatred that I had found on the bridge of the vigilant Constance. The hatred that was not the nails, and not Khorne, and not the whisper, but Rendahl Caeve, looking at the lie of the Imperium and deciding, freely and clearly, to despise it. That hatred was ugly, and it was damning, and it fed the blood god with every beat of my heart. But it was mine. I had chosen it. And Khorne did not want my choices. He wanted me dissolved. He wanted me poured into the river of mindless fury that flowed at the base of his throne, indistinguishable from every other soul he had consumed. He wanted to take the man who hated with purpose and turn him into a thing that killed without any. I would not give him that. Not out of goodness, not out of redemption, out of spite. The most human, the most petty, the most stubborn refusal imaginable. You can have my blood, you can have my body, you can have the years I have left and the kills I will make and every skull I will ever take, but you cannot have the part of me that knows why. That part is mine, and I will carry it into whatever darkness comes next, and it will be the last thing to go, and when it finally goes, then you will have won. But not today. I turned away from the door. The next part is fragmented. I remember running through corridors that were snapping back to their original forms as the ritual's power was drawn through the door, the flesh walls becoming metal again. The door was pulling everything toward it, every soul, every drop of blood. The ship around me was emptying, the boarding parties gone, the defenders gone, drawn through or consumed. I was alone. I ran through silence, through empty passageways lit by flickering lumens, and found an escape pod bay in the upper decks, untouched by the incursion. The pod launched. The two ships receded behind me, still fused, wreathed in a light that was not fire, and then the light folded in on itself, and they were gone. The pod drifted. When the viewports cleared, I saw the ruined shape of the Pelgranith orbital, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who has learned to recognize the blood god's sense of irony, that this was not coincidence. The warp had carried me home. I am in the orbital now. It is abandoned, has been for years by the look of it. The systems are dead, the corridors dark, the air thin but breathable. I have the Vox recorder and a few hours of power in its cell, and then it too will die. And I will be alone in the dark with the nails and the silence and the hatred that saved me from a god. The nails are still there. They will always be there. Even now, sitting in the dark, speaking into this recorder, I can feel them whispering, not screaming, not yet, but whispering, patient and persistent, the way they always are in the quiet times. They are telling me that I made a mistake, that the door is still open, that Osek will come for me, that the blood god does not forget and does not forgive, and the hole in my soul is still there, still waiting, still shaped like a key. They are right about all of it. But there is something they are wrong about, too. They say that Rendahl Caeve is dead, that the man who served aboard the Scythian Resolve died the day he picked up that pipe and stood over Torson's bunk. And maybe they are right. Maybe that man is dead. But the thing that replaced him still chooses. It still hates with purpose. It still knows why. And Khorne cannot use that. He can use the rage and the fury and the bloodlust and the killing. But he cannot use a man who looks at what he has become and says, "I did this because the Imperium made me, and I will not let you take even that from me." It is a small, ugly, selfish thing, this refusal. It is not heroic, it is not noble. It is a murderer clinging to his reasons the way a drowning man clings to wreckage, not because the wreckage will save him, but because letting go means the ocean wins. I am not dead. I am not saved. I am not redeemed. I am something worse than any of those things. I am a man who looked into the face of a god and turned away, not because he found something worth living for, but because the god demanded the one thing he would not give. And I know with absolute certainty that the nails are working on it. Every cycle, they grind a little deeper. Every cycle, the hatred gets a little less sharp, a little less specific, a little more like the formless, purposeless fury that Khorne wants it to become. One day I will wake up and I will not remember why I hate. I will only know that I do. And on that day, the door will open and there will be nothing left of me to refuse. But that day is not today. Today I still know why. And that will have to be enough. Khorne does not care whose blood flows, but I still care whose hatred burns. And for now, it is mine.